Welcome to our first set of discussions in Module 4 of the program for strengthening planning capacities of Ministry of Education officials in the OECS. This first set of discussions will look at the strategies to strengthen the effectiveness of the educational administration. As you will remember, there are several challenges that education systems face. In this particular module, we will look at the strategies to address these challenges and then subsequently at how we translate these strategies into programs. And in this first section, we look at the strategies to strengthen the effectiveness of the education administration. In this particular presentation, we will look at three different issues. Firstly, we will recall briefly the analytical framework that we have been using to examine the educational administration, its effectiveness, its functioning. We will then analyze some of the key challenges that many countries encounter in improving the effectiveness of the educational administration, and then we will identify some promising strategies. Let us recall the analytical framework that we examined in Module 2. As you will remember, our argument is that the effectiveness of the educational administration is the result of a set of different factors. And we have grouped these factors actually into 5 different elements. Firstly, an effective educational administration contains or works with or is rendered effective through the strength, the competence, and the profile of the individual officers. This will be our first point to look at. The second point to look at is how do these individual officers work together within the organization of which they are a part, which in most cases is a ministry department, a district office, a school. And we will also look at the overall impact that public service management has on the functioning of these ministries, of these ministry departments. At the same time, we take into account the relationship that this particular group of officers, that particular department, that particular ministry has with other partners working in the same area, and we also look at the overall context. You may remember the graph that I will present now. We have these different levels, the individual officers, we can examine their mandate, their tasks, their qualifications, and so on, work within an organizational unit which forms part of the educational administration. That administration itself forms part of the overall public administration, and that overall system is working within a particular context and with other partners. We will not here go again over a detailed examination of this framework. We did that in Module 2. What we want to do here is to examine some of the key challenges that have been identified when examining the functioning of educational administration and some promising strategies. Before going into some more detail on what are some of the recurring challenges, it is good though to put this a bit in context. Firstly, the effectiveness of the education administration differs very much from one country to another. It also differs within countries from time to time, between ministries, between the central level and the district level, sometimes even within a ministry and between ministries or within a ministry from one department to another, and it can change over time because of reforms, both change for the better, change for the worse. There is little systematic information, recently at least, on the situation in the OECS countries. There is little examination of the public administration, in particular the education administration in OECS countries. And therefore, what we have done is we have summarized in the following slides several analyses that were undertaken in a range of countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, including some in Europe. And we have highlighted some selected issues, but to a large extent, it is left also to you when reading through or when listening through this presentation to reflect from time to time, are these particular issues really relevant to my country? Do we have the same situation? Do we have a much better situation? Do we have a situation that is equally challenging? The readings we gave you are fairly similar to what we will present here. And the example of Zanzibar was an example that was meant indeed to inspire you so that you could reflect on your own situation as compared to a country that, in this case, Zanzibar, is somewhat comparable to the countries in the Eastern Caribbean. But I emphasize again that the situation can be very different and tends to be very different from one country to another. In the next slides, we will go over the different, what I would almost call typical challenges that we tend to encounter when we examine how the education administration functions, and we've organized them at the moment under three main headings: the individual level, the organizational level, and the way the public administration functions. We did not go into detail in all of the different elements, that would take us much too long, but we offer some of the highlights. Let us first look at the individual level, and a first point relates to the levels of competence of the different officers, of the individual officers, which make up the education administration, and link to that their training needs. And the first point is that this differs quite a bit from country to country, with some countries having a very competent set of officers with required qualifications, the required expertise, others in a much more challenging situation. At the same time, the needs and competencies also, of course, change over time because of reforms. And it is well possible that a particular officer who has been recruited 15, 20 years ago had the relevant profile and the relevant expertise at that time, but that it has not necessarily been updated. It is also true that from time to time, because of governance reforms, responsibilities are assigned to lower levels, the districts, the schools, for which the staff at that level is not necessarily fully prepared. And it is certainly important to keep in mind that within the education administration there are different areas of expertise, some more technical than others, and the specific technical areas can be from time to time very challenging. At the same time, and the COVID-19 crisis has well demonstrated this, the needs are not purely technical. The needs are also, to some extent, relational. The needs are also strategic. And a good example is the capacity to prepare for crisis, to prevent crisis, is a capacity that is increasingly important and is not something that you can easily summarize within a technical profile. So competency level, training needs differ within countries and between countries. One way, of course, to respond to these training needs is by offering training opportunities. And here the overall scenario is that in quite a number of cases, officers in ministries of education have significant training opportunities, but that training is not always well organized within an overall program and building year by year on the training that was offered beforehand. It is in many cases training that is somewhat dispersed by a short course here, a few months later another course there, on a theme that is of interest to this particular partner, early childhood education, gender, planning, and so on and so forth. And it is from time to time, the impression is that this overall training package is not really a well-integrated package, and it is more decided by the supply side, including those who organize and fund it, the development agencies in a number of cases. And one of the reasons for this the somewhat paradoxical scenario of many training opportunities, but a poor organization and integration of these training opportunities is the fact that in many countries, there are no national or regional agency centers, institutes that really manage this training as the main provider and the main manager. If that were the case, it would be easier to have a well-integrated program. And training centers in educational administration that provide professional training, not so much an academic qualification, but professional training, do not exist everywhere and are at times quite weak where they are existing. It is an interesting reflection to see what is the situation in the Caribbean, where we have a very strong regional university, the University of the West Indies, but maybe not an equivalent center in training in educational administration. And training is an important issue, but training also somewhere has to be part of an overall professional development program, of which training is a part, but which would include, for instance, the provision of clear guidelines and manuals, regular support, a real follow-up also on the training that has been delivered by examining how training is being used, and that really links clearly the training opportunities that are being offered to the profile of the different participants and to the needs of these participants. And here again, in quite a number of countries, ministries have prepared professional development programs from time to time, which precisely try to make sure that the training that is offered responds to the needs of the individual and the needs of the ministry within which that individual works, but somewhat quite regularly and unfortunately, these professional development programs have not always been a systematic initiative and not something that exists necessarily every year. It would again be interesting to see how in your country this plays out. Still, at the individual level, there can be other issues that can weaken the effects of training and that weaken the performance of the individual officers. In a number of cases, the profile for some specific staff in the education administration is not always very clear. And the expected tasks of a particular officer are not always made very explicit. And as a result, this leads to the recruitment of people who are not always the best placed to actually exercise these tasks, but it also makes it more difficult to define good training programs. In the work that we at the International Institute for Education Planning do, we have examined that, for instance, for education planners, and in many different countries, education planners, same for statisticians, same for human resource managers at times, less so for inspectors or curriculum officers, but for education planners, for instance, we regularly have a lack of a very clear profile, and as a result, we see that the people who are posted into the post of education planners do not always have the required skills and are not given the training that will allow them to acquire those skills. And a problem that exists in many countries where either the public administration is not particularly attractive or where there is a lot of pull from outside of the education administration, including in countries that are characterized by strong migration, there can be quick turnover of qualified personnel for reasons such as brain drain, for what we tend to call poaching, which means that an employer outside of the public service offers a more attractive position, but that can also be from time to time public services in other countries, or indeed the international public service. From time to time, political instability plays a role there also. So that's a scenario with some of the key challenges that we have encountered in our examinations of the public educational administration in different countries. This is a picture that is a little bit bleak, but that is on purpose because we have identified here the main challenges. Let us go now to the question of the organizational level. And here again, we can see that there is a complex set of constraints that can hinder the effectiveness of the organization and that also limit actually the usefulness of training. I highlight three here, and I'll come back to the fourth and the fifth in the next slide. In a number of cases, what we see is that within ministries of education or within particular departments, there is no common vision that everybody is aware of, that everybody is supportive on the role of the education administration, of the mandate and mission of particular units, particular departments, and there is in some cases no longer a belief that the organization can actually make a difference. I do not think that's the case in the OECS. I see that in much of this can be explained by a lack of progress in education systems. And in the OECS, education systems have continued progressing, and when we compare them within the international, the global environment, are quite well-functioning education systems. But it is certainly true in a number of other countries where the education administration on the whole has lost self-belief that the efforts that we as planners, as managers, as curriculum developers, as inspectors make, that these actually make a difference in the classroom, in the school. And that is a very difficult problem to address. Second issue, at times also a normative framework may be absent. With a normative framework, what we mean is an overall image of how the Ministry of Education has to perform, what are the roles of the different units, how are these units relating to each other, so what is the overall organizational chart? Within each of these units, how many people are needed to exercise the different roles, and what are the post descriptions for these people, what are the profiles, the required qualifications, the required experience, and so on. An overall framework that defines the roles and the structure of the education administration. That at times can be missing. And of course, the third problem is that time to time, the necessary resources to work effectively are absent. A typical example, which again may not be the case for the OECS, I'll leave that judgment to you, is one whereby inspectors are given a significant number of schools to supervise, but do not have the resources in particular vehicles and so on to actually even simply travel to these schools. I mentioned that there are two other problems or two other challenges that I want to emphasize here. Another challenge is related to the internal monitoring, the internal supervision and support. This relates to two elements. Are the mechanisms available and are they effective whereby supervisors within the hierarchy both supervise and support the people working within their unit, within their team? And does the performance of these individuals actually have a relationship to their particular position and their career development? And does this monitoring have an impact on the performance of these individuals and the performance of the organization? You may remember that in the questionnaire we had sent you before we started this course, on your training needs, we did have one question asking you about the support you receive from different sources in your organization, and on the whole, the answer there was quite positive and showed again that this particular challenge may be less present in the ministries of the OECS than elsewhere, where many of you expressed satisfaction with the support you receive from your supervisor. We will put some of these slides separately on the platform later. A final point is about accountability, whereby here the issue is as follows. The education administration is responsible to a large extent for the functioning, the improvement, the progress in the education system. If schools run well, if teachers are deployed regularly, if teachers get well supported, when students learn, the education administration can be said to properly exercise its function, most probably. But is there actually a demand for accountability? What happens when an education system is not making progress? When students are not learning as expected? Who takes the responsibility for this? Who is being held accountable? Who will act on it? Do we consider that this is only the responsibility of the teachers, of the students, or maybe their parents? Or maybe we blame it on the environment of the school? But do we also ask the question, what could the education administration, what could the ministry and its various departments have done better? Does such an accountability exist? And if so, how does it actually work? How can we separate the impact that the ministry has on schools from other factors? Undoubtedly, this is difficult. It is technically difficult, and it is also politically to some extent difficult. And as a result, from time to time, we do have the impression that the lack of progress on certain areas within education, nobody takes full accountability for it. And as a result, of course, it becomes difficult to act on it. So this is a complicated area, but it is not it's an important area, and it is not because we cannot find a perfect solution that we should not reflect on it. How do we feel as education officers, as planners, as curriculum officers, as chief education officers? How much of the progress in the education system do we consider to be our responsibility? We undoubtedly are proud when we see progress, but are we equally worried when there is a lack of progress, and do we take it also as our personal, to some extent, or certainly institutional responsibility? So that are a number of challenges that we see at the organizational level. Issues of resources, issues of communication collaboration, issues of monitoring, issues of accountability, and so on. Finally, a brief point now on the public administration. I recall that our analytical framework starts from the argument that the educational administration is part of the overall public administration, and much depends on the role that is assigned to the public service, on the characteristics of public service management. Are we in a public service that is run with respect for its neutrality? Are we in a public service where recruitment is open and transparent, and where indeed posts are properly advertised, and where competition for posts is open? Are we in a public service which is dedicated to the development of the country and is not used as a tool by politicians to gain loyalty among the public. There is a lot of literature on the characteristics of the public service. We will not go into this issue much more in detail, but it is true that in a number of countries, the improvement in the public service, or the improvement, let's say, in educational administration, can be threatened by the way in which the public service is used at times by policymakers. And this is particularly true for the civil service. There have been many attempts at civil service reforms. That is particularly difficult because it is a very delicate political element, and these reforms have not always had a very positive impact on the education system. Here again, I think the situation, as far as I can assess, the situation in many OECS countries is much more positive, with a public service that is indeed dedicated to the development of the country and is not one that is used by policymakers for posting at different posts friends and neighbors. There is always in every public service a level of policymakers that is politically nominated. That is the case in every public service, but in many OECS countries, if not in all, the overall profile of the public service is one of a relatively competent public service. So this is an overview of some of the key challenges to the effectiveness of the educational administration. I repeat again, this is based as much on international experiences, analysis that the IIP in this case has undertaken in many different countries, and on the international literature. And the invitation to you is to reflect on these elements and see which of these are particularly important for your country, where you feel that your country is doing much better, or which ones indeed ring a bell and you can say, yes, we have a similar challenge, even if it's maybe not as profound as the way I have presented it. In the next section, we will look now at some of the promising strategies to overcome these challenges. Thank you for your attention.